Hi students! In this video we are going to learn about completing the square. We're going to start by reviewing a few things. So look at these equations right here. These are all called quadratic equations, okay? The highest power of the variable is a 2, okay? So these are all quadratic equations written in different ways. And let's just look at one of the methods we've used to solve these equations. So just looking at, let's say, this one, we've learned to solve this using the factoring method. That's one method you can use. And so just recall that you can think of two numbers that when multiplied give you a -2, but when added give you a +1. And so that would be a 2 and a 1, or a 1 and a 2, however you want to write that. Because the middle term is positive, again, we want the bigger one to be positive, the smaller one to be negative. And then afterwards, remember that we would set each of these factors equal to 0. So x plus 2 equals 0 and x minus 1 equals 0. And we would solve these, okay, by subtracting in this case or adding in this case. So x would equal -2 if we subtracted 2 from both sides. And if we added 1 to both sides, we would get x equals 1. So that's one way that we have learned how to solve these quadratic equations. The other method that we used, so let's look at this one. So this one's in a little bit of a different form, and recall you also learned how to solve these on a previous lesson. So here, you know, we can't really, we wouldn't really want to multiply this back out. We could, but we could, might be kind of a pain to multiply it back out and then try to factor it. So when you saw these in your book, what we learned is that you can take the square root of both sides to undo this square right here. And then by doing that, that would get rid of the square, so those would undo each other, and then you would have what's left underneath, which is x minus 2. This would be plus or minus √3. Just recall, when you take the square root of something, you have plus or minus. And then to solve this, we have to add 2 to both sides. So if we add 2 to both sides, we get 2 plus or minus square root of 3. And so one answer would be 2 plus square root of 3, and one would be 2 minus square root of 3. So those are the two methods we've learned so far. What we want to do, actually, is get to this form, this original form that was x minus 2 squared equals a number. We want to get to that. The form is this. So they give you this form. And we're trying to get these quadratics, let's say, that are written in this form, we want to get them into this form. The reason being is, take a look at this one, x squared plus 4x minus 2. You can't really think of a number, factors of 2, that add to give you a 4. That's not going to work. So we can't use this factoring method that we've used before. We're going to have to solve this a different way. Now, this is one of the ways to solve it. We're going to complete the square to solve it. You could also use the quadratic formula as well. So in this lesson, again, we're going to do completing the square. So that's what this is all about. So by completing the square, we're going to be able to change this equation right here. We're going to change it into this equation, okay? And by changing it into that form, we're going to be able to then take the square root of both sides and then subtract 2 to get our final answer. So let's talk about what we mean by completing the square. So let's look at this right here. I'm just going to give you this example. We'll go ahead and do this one. So when you complete this square, you're trying to create a perfect square trinomial. So over here on the side, I'm just going to write that. Create a perfect square trinomial. And remember, a perfect square trinomial, if you can remember what that was, and I'll write this here, x squared plus 4x plus blank. We're trying to complete the square, create a perfect square trinomial by thinking of the number that we would add to this that would, make it factor into the form like this, where you've got the same number, okay, in both of these, okay? How you do that, you actually look at the middle term. So the 4, you look at the coefficient of the middle term. And what you want to do is you take half of that. So you're going to take 4 and divide it by 2. And then you're going to square that number. So this is b divided by 2 squared. Okay? Remember, in a quadratic, you have a, b, and c. All right? So look at the middle term, and the coefficient in front of that is b, the b value. Take that number, divide it by 2, and then square it. So 4 divided by 2 is 2. And 2 squared is 4. So this is the number that completes the square, creates a perfect square trinomial. Think about how to factor this. So if you factor this, you have to think, what two numbers, or the same number, what's the number when multiplied by itself gives you a 4, but when added to itself gives you a 4? That would be 2 and 2. And notice they're the same. So we can rewrite this by saying x plus 2 squared. Okay? Notice we got that up here when I rewrote it. So you're trying to create a perfect square trinomial in this problem. Okay, so that is completing the square, at least creating the perfect square trinomial. If you want to solve it by completing the square, let's keep going. So let me show you how to do that. So we're going to write this. I'll write it here so I can show you. Go ahead and add the number to both sides. So you're going to have x squared plus 4x equals 2. And I'm going to leave a little space here because what I want to do is add the number that completes the square on this left side. And by doing that, what I have to do is if I add it to the left side of the equation, I'm going to have to add it to the right side. And just recall, again, when we completed the square, we took half of this number and then we squared that. Half of 4 is 2, 2 squared is 4. So 4 is what you add to both sides of the equation. If I add it to the left, I have to add it to the right. And then we factor this. So we factor this to x plus 2 squared, and then 2 plus 4 is 6. So notice we got it into that form that we wanted. From here, we're able to solve this by taking the square root of both sides. So you'll get x plus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 6. And the very last step here is subtract 2. Okay? And so we would get a negative 2 plus or minus root 6. So that is how you complete this square to solve these. Okay, and again, remember we're trying to get it in this form. That's what we want to do. Let's do one more. So in your book, we did one kind of like example 1. I'll do example 2 in your book. It just, puts it in a slightly different order. So notice this isn't in the same order as we had it before. It's not in descending order by the power of x. We want to put this first, right? We want to put the highest power first. Then the next term would be the one with the power of 1, x power of 1, and then minus 5 equals 0. So now we've got it in the form that we saw earlier. Don't forget, we're going to add this value to the other side, okay? So if I add 5 to both sides, I get it in this form. X squared plus 2x equals 5. Now I want to complete the square. So to think of what number I'm going to be adding to both sides, what number completes the square over here? And then whatever number that is, we're going to add it over to the right side. So for this one, again, take half of this. So half of 2, and I'll do that over here. Half of 2, and then you're going to square it. So that is 1 squared, which is 1. So we're just adding a 1 to both sides. So plus 1 and plus 1. Then remember, we can factor this. Okay, we can write it like this. X and x, right, to get the x squared, and then what number, what two numbers when multiplied, or what number, in this case, when multiplied by itself, gives you a 1, but added to itself gives you a 2, so that's a 1 and a 1. They're both positive. Notice these are the same factors here, so we can write it as x plus 1 squared. Okay? So x plus 1 squared, and over on the right side, we have 6. So now we have x plus 1 squared equals 6. So let's go a little further here. So x plus 1 squared equals 6. So remember, to solve this, we're going to square root both sides. And when we do that, we get x plus 1 equals plus or minus root 6. Again, 6 is not a perfect square, so we just have to kind of leave it under that square root. Very final step, subtract 1 from both sides. And we usually write this one first. So we're going to say x equals, and we're going to say negative 1 plus or minus root 6. So I hope this was helpful. I can share a separate video on just completing the square. And I'll see you in the next one.